Let's talk about getting a force of cybernetically augmented Space Marines off the ground, with an overview of starting Iron Hands in 10th edition 40k. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Space Marines once more, and in this video I thought we'd focus on the Sons of the Gorgon, with some thoughts on starting an Iron Hands army. In the video let's talk about why you might want to choose the chapter in the first place, a few thoughts on planning out a force, some ideas for first models to choose, and an overview of the rules for Feirros Manus and the Ironstorm Spearhead. Loads to talk about, so let's jump straight into it. First up, why might you want to collect Iron Hands in the first place? In the lore, the Iron Hands are the 10th Legion of Space Marines, known for their methodical and brutal approach to warfare. Once they've decided to achieve a goal, they will pursue it relentlessly and bitterly, fighting to win by any means necessary, including things that might be distasteful to their fellow Imperium. The Iron Hands often stand apart from their battle brothers, harbouring a bitter resentment towards the traitors who slew their Primarch and the Imperial allies alike that they were fighting alongside and allowed it to happen. Their disdain for weakness and failure includes them looking at their physical bodies, believing that the flesh is weak, and they make extensive use of bionic replacement parts and cybernetic enhancements to give their warriors the edge on the battlefield. A slightly injured leg or arm might be wholesale replaced by a new bionic one, and their warriors can be remarkably tough to kill as a result, durable adamantium parts giving them advantages and sustaining damage that might have otherwise incapacitated them. The chapter has an interesting organisational structure, organised into clan companies with no single chapter master, instead ruled over by a voting system of the Iron Council, which features many dreadnoughts amongst their ranks. Also high in the chapter's organisation are the Iron Fathers, whose role basically combines the role of a chaplain and a tech marine, both serving as spiritual leaders and maintaining the chapter's vast armoury. Compared with some of their battle brothers, they make war with perhaps a slight preference for ranged combat versus melee compared with some. As well as their bionically augmented warriors, the Iron Hands field a great number of dreadnoughts, tanks and other war machines in their ranks, trusting to armour and adamantium above the flesh wherever possible. Miniatures-wise, the Iron Hands basically use the vast Space Marine range at the moment, one of the biggest and most frequently updated out there, with new Primaris models seemingly guaranteed each time a new edition of the game comes round, and often in between. Aside from a few of the fleshed out divergent chapters, individual chapter representation isn't enormous in 40k. The Iron Hands' only 40k relevant parts are a single upgrade sprue and a unique character miniature in Iron Father Feirros. Plenty of unit choices are perhaps a bit more appropriate for them than others though, and there's a fair few themed unit upgrades and unique units from the Horus Heresy range if desired, though mostly done in expensive resin. Looking through just a few of the many examples of models, for the standard Space Marine range you might have things like your standard Primaris Intercessors and Aggressors, all painted up in their iconic black and silver colour scheme of course. You likely want to go a bit heavier on the vehicles and war machines, perhaps the Iron Hands Redemptor Dreadnought in particular. I feel like any Iron Hands force that plays lore heavy is likely to have at least a few dreadnoughts amongst its ranks, maybe mixing in some other mechanised elements, things like the Space Marine Repulsor or Repulsor Executioner to provide some big firepower with a laser destroyer. For actual themed Iron Hand kits for Warhammer 40k, they've got this upgrade sprue and transfer set that you can see on the left. It basically comes with 2 copies of this same sprue, a whole bunch of chapter iconography shoulder pads, a couple of studded ones, and a few having a pleasing cogtooth pattern along the side. They also have a few bionically augmented heads, one bionic arm, and a bionic arm that's holding a bolter. Their unique character miniature is Iron Father Feirros. This miniature basically a bigger and badder Primaris Tech Marine but fielded in Gravis armour, and hefting rather an enormous Omniscient axe. I'll get into his rules in game later in the video. Otherwise, as mentioned, they do have some themed units for the Horus Heresy game, Medusan Immortals with some great big shields and bolters, and Gorgon Terminator squads equipped with combi bolters and great power axes. These could be another option to add a bit more Iron Hands theme to an army, though I would bear in mind that they don't scale quite as well versus Primaris these days. Both the regular scale Marines and the Terminators are a bit shorter than the contemporary 40k ones. They do also have a miniature for poor martyred Feirros Manus, Primarch of the Legion and a great mind and inventor, brutally murdered by his brother Fulgrim during the Horus Heresy. I guess it doesn't really make lore sense to be including him in a 40k setting, though if you did want to pick up the miniature for theme and fun purposes, I guess you could perhaps run him with the rules for Rabute Gilliman perhaps, if you did want something appropriate as an excuse to put him on the table. Price-wise, Space Marines in general and Iron Hands tend to be cheaper than most for 40k. Space Marines have got loads of access to discount deals and are usually fairly elite, so you don't tend to need as many units of them on the table. If you go heavy on things like Redemptor dreadnoughts, then you might fill out points a little bit better. Some of the bigger tanks and vehicles have got slightly better points per dollar ratios than some of the more elite squads of 3 Space Marines in 40k, but there's plenty of options for some savings. Finally, gameplay-wise, the Iron Hands use the core rules for Codex Space Marines, and you can paint up a force of them that uses any of the detachments here, anything from the Gladius to the Firestorm Task Force to the big firepower Anvil Siege Force. As mentioned, I would have guessed Iron Hands would usually play a bit more range focused than melee if you're collecting an army of them, and in reality I feel like quite a lot of the different detachments could represent their style of fighting quite well. Though they do have their themed detachment in the Ironstorm Spearhead, that one aiming to be a force that best supports tanks, vehicles and dreadnoughts, and has a bunch of themed rules with names and lore that are sort of appropriate for the Iron Hands, though can still be used by any chapter. Again, I'll go through the rules of this in a bit more detail later. It did used to be pretty much one of the single strongest Space Marine detachments, though Games Workshop nerfed it in a balance update. It can still be a scary list to go against, though I'd say it's now at a point where it isn't more so than things like Gladius or Vanguard. Even if its sheer damage and defense can still be intimidating. Father Feirros himself, I guess, is the other main choice for the Iron Hands. I put him in the category where he's usable, though not really commonly used competitively at all, just not really breaking through versus the other chapters out there, and again not really done any favours by 40k's chapter balancing system, where just for raw strength, Iron Hands are going to be compared to Ultramarines with far more characters on offer, or the Divergent chapters. Just in general, Space Marines are a little bit underpowered versus the rest of the field in Warhammer 40k, though Games Workshop certainly regularly updates game balance things, so it's unlikely to stay that way for super long. In any case, if you want to collect an army of black-clad, bionically augmented and bitter Space Marines fighting with a heavy contingent of dreadnoughts, then the Iron Hands might be the chapter for you. If you do decide to go to Iron Hands, then you can move on to planning an army. I'd likely plan out a rough 1000 point or 2000 point list using Battlescribe New Recruits or maybe the Warhammer app, and have some sort of rough idea as to where you might want to wind up when you get to an army of any given size. Space Marines have an absolutely vast amount of miniatures to choose from, so 2 given Space Marine armies could look pretty much entirely different in terms of units included. There's loads of options with which way you could go. You could potentially just collect a more balanced army and build up a mix of units that appeal to you the most, adding bits as you go along. You could collect specifically for the Ironstorm Spearhead in Codex Space Marines, taking along a bunch of Tech Marines and vehicles as your primary units. You could just primarily focus on an army that will have a good overall look and feel for an Iron Hand sort of force once you complete the collection. For things to emphasise, you can pretty much go for a mix of anything. Those certainly have a good contingent of dreadnoughts, a fair amount of vehicles, and some Tech Marines to support them. Otherwise, Iron Hands certainly make good use of infantry formations as well. Perhaps the more bionic augmented conversions the better. I'd say their infantry maybe classically tends to be a bit more slower moving for the most part though. Perhaps a bit more of a focus on slower and mighty things as opposed to fast moving hard hitters, though of course they can use anything that the Codex's arsenal has to offer. You also could just collect for balanced in-game effectiveness. Certainly some things stand out far more than others for a Space Marine army right now, focusing on getting some primary objective holders, some big damage dealer units, and some sneaky mission type units to jump around doing secondaries and things. Though as usual, if things get balance updates, this can change quite a bit. Otherwise, you could think about establishing a paint scheme as well. I'd say lightly something like an Intercessor, Assault Intercessor, or Infernus Marine might be a good place to start for an Iron Hands test scheme. Basically a rank and file sort of miniature to be a good example of how you'll paint up your standard Space Marines, and ideally something smaller than a central character or a big vehicle or something, so if you don't like the way that it's come out, you can potentially redo or make adjustments, and it's not going to take you forever. There's loads of good painting guides here on YouTube. Plenty of people have made things to show how to paint Iron Hands. In general, I'd say their black and silver colour scheme is kind of forgiving, though painting black armour can be a bit of a slog, and you might be left with a slightly dour and practical looking army on the tabletop, as is their nature. You don't necessarily have to stick to a black and silver colour scheme though. You could certainly go for a successor chapter of the Iron Hands. There's several that exist out there in the lore and having very different colour schemes, though of course you can absolutely make up your own. Otherwise you could think about how you're going to do chapter markings and shoulder pads and things. If you've got patience and a good eye for freehand, I'd say the Iron Hand symbol is one that you could potentially freehand on to the shoulder pads, though plenty of people prefer the sculpted chapter markings that you can get on the upgrade sprues, or potentially using transfers. Plenty of 3D printing creators have also made suitable chapter logos for various different Space Marine armies out there. There certainly are some Iron Hands ones if you look hard enough, and that could be another way to get a whole bunch of sculpted chapter icons a fair bit cheaper than Games Workshop will be able to do. Otherwise though, let's talk miniatures, and as ever with starting Space Marines, I think most of the time it would make sense to start out with one of the Space Marine discount box sets, of which there really are quite a lot to choose from. Likely one of the starter sets, units from the Leviathan box, or one of the combat patrols would probably be my first port of call. Though if you wanted a box set that didn't cost quite as much as those, probably a basic squad of troops of some sort, maybe intercessors, heavy intercessors, or even some hellblasters perhaps, if you just wanted to get some Space Marines on the table and dip a toe into the faction without committing loads of money. This is the Combat Patrol Space Marines box set with 5 Terminators, 5 Infernus Marines, and 2 Terminator characters. The miniatures are fairly nice new ones, even if they are monopose sculpts, and they came out alongside the Leviathan box set. In terms of the actual Combat Patrol box set, it's really not the best deal, though in reality you should absolutely never get this one, and instead get the starter box sets, as it's a pathway to get literally these exact same miniatures for cheaper. If you did want the generic Space Marine Combat Patrol, then instead you should either pick up the 40k starter set as pictured here, and then pick up a Terminator Librarian separately if you'd like that, or go for the Ultimate Starter set, which does cost a bit more than the Combat Patrol, but comes with some terrain and a softcover rulebook as well. On the Space Marines, you basically do save a bit of money by getting the standard starter set, though it also comes with a whole bunch of Tyranids as well that you could either trade for something else or just paint up as a painting project. Basically, the bottom line is just literally never get the actual Space Marine Combat Patrol and get the miniatures through this if you'd like. I say as they go, the sculpts are nice enough. The new Terminator models in particular are pretty popular, though they don't come with the Cyclone missile launcher. And it does go slightly heavier on the character front, getting 2 characters to lead 1 Terminator squad, which is 1 more than you'd like, unless you pick up another box of them. Still though, at least if you get them via the starter set and are able to sell or trade away the Tyranids or something, it is one of the best deals for Space Marine points for the money. As ever, when picking up Warhammer miniatures, there's plenty of different options for doing so, some more expensive than others. Direct from Games Workshop is generally the most reliable, but also the most expensive. And in general, if you're looking for new plastic, I typically go either via local gaming stores or online discount retailers, official stockists of Games Workshop products, usually giving between 10 and 20% off new Warhammer kits. I've got a bunch of those links down in the video description around the world that save you somewhere between 10 and 21% on the cost of Warhammer models. Element Games in the UK, Gap Games in Australia, Fenris Workshop in Canada, and Wargame Portal in the USA. And if you do happen to buy anything through them, a small amount goes to help support Auspex Tactics without costing you any more. Sites like these are generally where I go if I'm picking up new plastic miniatures first. There are other options to new shiny plastic kits though. If you're not quite as bothered about the exact posing or the equipment of every single model, you could look to the second-hand market. Space Marines tend to have an absolutely enormous reselling market due to so many people collecting them, so it could well be worth a look on eBay or other second-hand sites like Facebook Marketplace and things. Quality can of course be very variable, but can be a pathway to save a lot of money and potentially time as well. Otherwise, 3D printing and third-party manufacturers are an ever-growing option these days. Lots of great alternative sculpts exist out there, and it can be a handy choice for getting certain parts, weapons, and cosmetic upgrades like those shoulder pads. Otherwise though, let's look through a bunch of other Space Marine deals. Probably one of the most obvious for 10th edition is the Leviathan box set. The launch box for 10th edition and was originally £150 or $245, now sold out at the Games Workshop web store, though there's plenty of boxes around in physical locations, and you can still find some alright prices on them on Amazon and eBay, and could be another interesting option. The Space Marine half, I think, for Leviathan is far more generous compared with their starter set offerings. You get a Ballistus Dreadnought, a couple more characters, 5 Stern Guard and 5 Infernus Marines. And even if you can't find the main box set, if you could find a box half going for £100 or less, or $150 or less, you get more stuff here than you get in a typical Combat Patrol box. The Ballistus Dreadnought feels all very appropriate for Iron Hands as well, a big stompy shooty Dreadnought. Otherwise, for picks of the Space Marine discount offerings, the Blood Angels one might be a particularly good one to look at. I feel like this one is actually really quite a balanced starter box for Primaris Marines. You get 5 Sneaky Phobos, 5 Intercessors, 3 Aggressors, and an Impulsor Transport, plus a Librarian to lead them. I feel like that's quite a good representation and a fairly good balance of forces that you might find in any chapter. Otherwise, there's also the Dark Angels one. That one's Intercessors, Hellblasters, Blade Guard, and a Gravis Captain. Again, is reasonable enough for the discount if those are miniatures that you are looking up to fill out the rank and file battle line. The Space Wolf one has an Invicta warsuit alongside Intercessors and Reavers. The unique battle leader for this one is a bit more obviously Space Wolf themed, so might need a bit of conversion work if you're going to use him for another chapter. Finally, for the more mainstream discount box sets, there's also the Vanguard Task Force, basically the old Start Collecting Space Marine Force, which gives you a whole bunch of Phobos Marines, including some Eliminators, Infiltrators, and Suppressors. This one's an online-only one, though certain discount retailers still give discounts on them, such as Wargame Portal in the USA. I'd say the value on this one is fairly comparable to the Combat Patrol box sets, and the units are usable enough, particularly the Infiltrators. Finally, for looks at main discount kits, another option for cheaper Marines might be a different take with the Horus Heresy box set. The Age of Darkness starter set is a massive £195 or $315, but in terms of Marines and points on the board per the money spent, it's one of the best Games Workshop deals that they have currently. You will just need to do a bit of adaptation for the rules of these towards more contemporary 40k. I'd likely run the Tactical Marines as Intercessors, the Terminators as regular Terminators, the Spartan as a Land Raider, and the Dreadnought as a regular Firstborn Dreadnought. It could give you a Space Marine army in a different sort of theme and feel, and maybe have a force that could be relevant for 2 gaming systems rather than 1, though it would be quite a project and a bit different to the way that most people approach Space Marines these days. In any case, my overall take would be to start the collection with one of these discount box sets and then build out from there once you've got a good amount of Marines on the table for the money. Taking a look at the actual Iron Hands themed things in a little bit more detail, first up we have Ironfather Feirros, 95 points for a Gravis Armoured Tech Marine with a 2+ save, and he can lead either Aggressors, Eradicators or Heavy Intercessor squad. Feirros is perhaps a little bit of a peculiar choice as he does a little bit of 3 different things. He acts as a Tech Marine essentially, giving you a big heal 3 lost wounds to a vehicle within 3 inches and +1 to the hit roll, so ideally you want to have some sort of big stompy vehicle for him to support with that. Maybe something like a Redemptor Dreadnought or Repulsor Executioner or Vindicator perhaps. Then the second part of his value is that he gives a 5+ Feel No Pain type save to the unit that he's leading, which is genuinely quite a good boost as well, but that also means that he likely wants to have a retinue to support him, and that's going to cost a lot more points. Out of these, my temptation would be to go for a 5-man squad of Heavy Intercessors most likely. I feel like for the Eradicators and the Aggressors, they're still pointed to the extent where they're not going to be super durable with that 5+ Feel No Pain, and still well worth the enemy just taking big chunks out of them, particularly if they're marching up the board in support of vehicles. Heavy Intercessors though are already durable, so getting a Feel No Pain on top of that can make them impressively annoying to remove. They can contribute a fair amount of objective control to holding points and also have a bit of firepower as well. The last bit of his value is his actual damage. He fires off with a slightly scary heavy bolter with sustained hits too, and then is punchier than you might expect in melee for a more support character kind of leader. 6 attacks at strength 7 damage 2 and another 2 at strength 8 damage 3. That's definitely going to take a chunk out of any medium infantry around. If you did want to put him on the board, my game plan would be to have him with some Heavy Intercessors, move up in support of some vehicles that want to get closer, and then in the mid to late game have him fighting over the midfield objectives, get that melee profile to good work, and make the enemy actually have to chew through those abnormally durable Heavy Intercessors if they want to take the objective from you. Admittedly, at his current points cost, he rarely sees the table in terms of competitive play, maybe just a little bit hard to make all 3 of his value things work. Though I feel like if you're using him specifically in that way, it's really not as bad as the internet might try and make out. Otherwise, for themed Iron Hands things, this is the upgrade sprue and the transfer sheet. Getting your hands on some Iron Hands transfers could be kind of good for shoulder pad markings and things if you want them going forward. They can be a bit of an investment versus just the regular Space Marines on their own, though if you use the transfers and the shoulder pads maximally, at least that should supply a fair amount of the Space Marines and give you just a few other extra little charms and details to sprinkle some theme about the army. Otherwise, for unit choices with options to expand, I'd be tempted to pick up at least 1 Tech Marine early if you are going to go at least kind of vehicle heavy. They're pretty good value in their own right in game at 55 points, a nice boost for vehicles, and I'd feel them going so low with their lone operative thing when they stand next to the vehicles they're leading. And again, they can get surprisingly punchy if a vehicle dies nearby to them. Getting a whole bunch of anti-elite attacks, maybe the Redemptor Dreadnought will be another one I'd be tempted by sooner rather than later. Quite nice general purpose ones and work well with Tech Marines, and their -1 damage can make them a massive pain to remove, particularly if you use Armour of Contempt on them. Currently I'd be tempted to arm them with the macroplasma and then the onslaught Gatling cannon in the fist hand. The macroplasma in particular gets on well with the single hit or wound reroll that you might get from Ironstorm Spearhead if you're using that formation. Otherwise, for options for expanding, at the moment there's a whole bunch of Space Marine units that are just kind of easy enough to use in literally any army list, and I wouldn't really question their presence if they'd been included in a competitive list for virtually any sort of purposes. Scouts are just really nice to hold the midfield, cheap expendable units that can screen or have some objective presence and have that nice special rule to hop on and off the board to do secondaries when needed. Jump intercessors are just 80 points and are quite nice secondary skirmish sort of units and can hit quite hard with the mortal wounds and their power fist on the charge as well. Just very good value overall for 80 points. And Space Marine infiltrators are often included in one squad of 5 of them, often sat to hold the backfield if the opponent's got some sort of scary deep strike threat out there. Though depending on the army, you could use them as an actual infiltrating unit and put them in the midfield for a slightly tankier objective holding unit if screening out every deep strike isn't necessary. For expanding the army in general, there's always a whole load of scope for just collecting what you like the look of in Warhammer 40k, given that rules change over time, and Space Marines have got such a big range that trying to keep up with the literal best army could be hugely different from one balance update to another, and I'd honestly just collect slowly and balanced, building up things as you like them. Maybe perhaps the thing to focus on if you're a newer collector is to get some mainline damage dealers on the go sooner rather than later. With a lot of the starter sets and lots of Space Marine with bolters out there, it can be easy enough to collect an army that just doesn't really have too much bite against big tough heavy hitters. You need some units that can deal with tanks and monsters, and some units that can deal with tough 3 wound infantry with a 2+ armor save. So that means some big scary guns or big hitting close combat units with high AP and at least damage 2 or more. I generally say that the vast majority of units in Codex Space Marines are really quite playable at the moment in one form or another. After several balance passes, fewer things are just absolutely stand out and fewer things are just completely useless. If you're going Iron Hands and a focus on dreadnoughts and vehicles, maybe things like Redemptors, Ballistas dreadnoughts, Predators, Vindicators and Repulsor Executioners, plus basically any of the Gladiator tanks are usable enough. And for elite infantry, maybe things like Hellblasters, Eradicators, maybe some Blade Guard veterans charging out of a Land Raider. There's lots of solid enough options there, and often the best thing tends to vary very heavily depending on detachment and what sort of supporting rules they can get. I'd have a rough idea for a 2,000 point army list and gradually build towards it. I fully expect there's the possibility of change both with game balance updates and things, plus units that you particularly like or get inspired by to field on the tabletop. As mentioned, the Iron Hands kind of have their own bespoke detachment within Codex Space Marines in the Ironstorm Spearhead, a force that themed to put a whole load of vehicles, dreadnoughts and tech marines on the table, and might often try and win just by dealing enough damage to sweep the enemy off the table and win the game outright. The core rule for the detachment is Armoured Wrath, allowing you to reroll 1 hit, wound or damage roll per unit per phase, and this one applies to everything, including infantry and to melee as well as range, so while it's perhaps particularly helpful for really big hitting vehicles with single strong shots, like Repulsor Executioners or Vindicators perhaps, it's also kind of helpful for things like an infantry unit with a hidden power fist in it, like maybe a jump intercessor or regular intercessor unit. For their stratagems, you have access to Armour of Contempt, which is often really helpful for big tough dreadnoughts in particular. A 2+ save with Armour of Contempt and cover is great for keeping dreadnoughts durable. And other than that, there's a whole load of good support things. Vengeful Animus for an auto-explode if you need it. Occasionally it can be kind of game-changing, but often the vehicles just aren't going to be in the good position to use it. Ancient Fury to boost a walker with +1 to their movement toughness, save, leadership, objective control, and hit roll. Maybe the hit roll being the single most useful out of those things, though the rest could all matter depending on the circumstances. Power of the Machine Spirit is kind of situational, but pretty powerful in the right circumstances. You essentially get to return fire with your vehicle against something that shot it, but only if your vehicle was brought down to less than half health. Occasionally that's enormous though, being able to basically fire back with a full Vindicator or a Repulsor Executioner or something, and deal some hideous damage in the enemy's turn. Unbowed Conviction can allow you to ignore modifiers. Could be handy for bracketed vehicles or if the opponent's got lots of stealth and things. You do have to be below starting strength to trigger it though. And finally Mercy's Weakness, which got bumped up to 2 command points, This one's a sustained hits on a 5+ for vehicle units, so certainly makes vehicles fire a lot harder, though I feel like now it's 2 command points, you can often get better value for your command points elsewhere, unless you're combining it with the enhancements. Talking of which, there's 4 of these. Typically people tend to focus on the vehicle buffing ones, the target augury web for one vehicle getting lethal hits at range, Adept of the Omnicide to cancel a failed saving throw, changing the damage to 0, which can be massive if you were hit by something like a big d6+ damage weapon. A Master of Machine War is really quite handy to have. One friendly vehicle within 6 inches can shoot if it either advanced or fell back. That's a bigger deal than it might seem at first glance, as it gives you a lot more flexibility with getting your units shooting and not having to stay in combat with things that might be dangerous. It certainly took some nerfs in a recent balance update. I feel like if you're using the target augury web for 30 points, you probably need to think about combining it with Mercy as weakness, so it's really quite a big all-in choice, but it does mean that you can have some very scary firepower on the go. Both lethal hits and sustained hits on a 5+, potentially re-rolling everything that isn't a 5+ with Oath of Moment. You can make one vehicle just go into absolute rage mode. Overall, it still seems that people are playing with it competitively and having at least some success, though following the nerfs that Games Workshop did to the stratagem and enhancements, the Ironstorm Spearhead is certainly topping far less tournaments than it used to. Finally though, here's just one example of what an Iron Hands Ironstorm list could look like. The idea for this one is to really focus on the tanks, dreadnoughts and vehicles, and have it led up by Ironfather Feirros for theme with a couple of tech marines, and then just a few units for a little bit of Space Marine support. The list is aimed to be 2,000 points, but won't be exactly that, particularly after Games Workshop's next balance update, where the points might shift around a little bit. I'd take it more for just a general idea of roughly what you can achieve than an exact you must copy this type thing. In any case, we've got 2 tech marines, one using Master of Machine War and one with Adept of the Omnicide, keeping those vehicles safe and mobile. And then Feirros himself, so you can have 3 of the vehicles hitting on a 2+ and regenerating a whole load of wounds in total. Feirros will be running with those heavy intercessors to make them extra durable and hopefully tanky a fair bit of damage as they march into the midfield alongside the Redemptor Dreadnought perhaps. These guys will be buffing a good mix of Space Marine firepower. We've got one Redemptor Dreadnought with a Macro Plasma, 2 Ballistas Dreadnoughts for some hard-hitting anti-tank firepower, a Predator Destructor with las cannon sponsons and a Vindicator for a little bit of firstborn armor, 2 Gladiators in a Reaper and a Lancer, and a big Reporter Executioner as perhaps a particularly good choice for tech marine buffs or any enhancements or stratagems. Between all that, there should be a fair amount of danger that's got enough heavy hitting firepower to take down enemy tanks and still having lots of volume fire on the go with a whole bunch of small arms, storm bolters, defensive arrays, and particularly that Gladiator Reaper to help thin out hordes. Finally, we've just got a small nod to scoring secondary points and objectives, a combi weapon lieutenant for a disruptive lone operative that's hard to catch up with around terrain, 5 scouts with a missile launcher that can make use of the Ironstorm rerolls, a unit of infiltrators with their deep strike denial, and a unit of jump intercessors with a power fist, potentially there to drop in and do secondaries and then skirmish with enemy objective scorers that you might not be able to catch up with. Between all the armoured hulls and dreadnoughts, this should put out a pretty scary amount of firepower and can often win a direct firefight against enemies. The biggest issues, maybe in more cluttered tournament terrain boards, might be that you struggle to get lines of sight on things, and you really need to think hard about pushing up towards the midfield objectives to make sure that the opponent can't hide, and that might be a little bit counterintuitive to tanks with good range that would often be able to just sit back and shoot if there were other things doing that. Your shooting phase would certainly be a highlight though, loads of big scary guns to bring down the enemy's scariest monsters and war machines. In any case, I'll leave that there for this one. Let me know your thoughts on collecting Iron Hands in 40k 10th edition. Look forward to hearing all your insights down in the comments. If you'd like something else Space Marine to watch, then I'll leave a link to my Space Marines tier list video. That's linked down in the video description. A bit of a run through of Space Marine units and their strength in game right now. Feel free to subscribe if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. Finally, if you have been enjoying the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep these coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, an automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.